Well, you all know me by now and that I like to respond to Sun media because I really don't like it. Now, 2 years ago, a Canadian Armed Forces Captain Rob Summerall was convicted of disgraceful conduct because he executed an unarmed, wounded combatant. Now, he then eventually did go to another trial, which they charged him with murder, attempted murder, and negligence of duty. Now, despite the fact that he had been charged, he was actually found not guilty. Now, the judge, Jean-Guy Perron, had some very choice words for him during that trial. Shooting a wounded and unarmed person is disgraceful because it is so fundamentally contrary to our values and training that it is shockingly unacceptable. Every Canadian soldier is an ambassador of Canadian values. Your actions may have been motivated by a sense that you were doing the right thing. Nonetheless, you committed a serious breach of discipline. How can we expect our soldiers to follow the rules of war if their officers do not? Now, in Sun media fashion, Peter Worthington, who himself is a combat veteran, was the first one to step up and defend the disgraceful conduct that was carried out by soldiers doing things they're not supposed to be doing, where it is Summerall, in this case, that he was specifically speaking about. Now, he said that the judge was going too far in saying something like that, and that the judge didn't understand what war was like, and this goes against how war is done, and that he's a desk jockey, and that he doesn't know anything about actual war, and stuff like that. Now, what he did do was he presented 9 arguments as to why what Summerall actually did was not wrong. Now, what I'm going to do is go through all 9 of his arguments and show how they're not arguments and are horribly flawed. What was the serious breach of discipline? What was the disgraceful conduct? Summerall was absolved of all 3 major charges, not guilty on all of them. Just because a jury decided that his shooting an unarmed, wounded man was not illegal doesn't mean it wasn't disgraceful. Shooting unarmed people who are wounded is disgraceful. He was no longer an enemy combatant as he was unable to defend himself. He shot and killed a person who was incapable of defending themselves. That is a cowardly act in, well, any context whatsoever. It is. Now, just because a jury finds you not guilty doesn't mean you didn't do it. O.J. Simpson was found not guilty of murdering his wife in Goldman. And it's absolutely very clear to me and a great many of people that he actually is guilty, despite the idiotic conduct by the police, which eventually allowed him to walk. Just because a jury of your peers don't think you did anything wrong doesn't mean you didn't. The point here is to prove why what the judge said is wrong. It's his opinion. His opinion didn't have an effect on the case. The ruling was still separate from the judge's opinion. Also, his apparent view that on a battlefield wounded enemy are not or should not be killed taxes the credulity and ignores what happens in war. Worthington's statement here implies that unarmed wounded people are killed all the time. That's exactly what he's saying. And just because something happens all the time, it doesn't mean it's okay. Just because a law is broken all the time doesn't mean it's not illegal. I mean, there are Geneva Convention things about executing prisoners and executing people who can't defend themselves. Again, just because something happens all the time and you're okay with it doesn't mean that it is okay. That's not an argument as to what he did wasn't wrong. Then he basically gives an anecdote from the movie Saving Private Ryan. Saving Private Ryan is not real. It's based on a true story, but the anecdote about the German soldier who was pretending to be dead and then rising up and shooting people is not real. I'm sure this does happen, but when you're trying to say why something isn't wrong, an example from something that doesn't exist is not really the best way to do that. You should be demonstrating how it was not wrong, not creating a different situation with a different set of circumstances in order to compare it, especially when those circumstances in the event that he's speaking of don't actually exist. Take the example of Omar Cotter. When U.S. forces invaded Afghanistan and shot up an enemy position thinking everyone had been killed, Cotter wasn't dead and tossed a grenade that killed one and wounded another. This is a very strange argument. His argument is that someone who was posing a threat and did kill somebody wasn't shot, so somebody who was unarmed and wounded, not posing a threat, should be killed. That doesn't seem to make any sense. If anything, Worthington should be saying that Omar Cotter should have been killed as well, but he wasn't. How does not killing someone who is a threat justify killing someone who is not a threat? It doesn't even make any sense. You don't have to look very deeply into the Pacific War against Japan to find cases of mortally wounded Japanese soldiers trying to kill their attackers. Yes, and while they are mortally wounded, they are in the process of trying to attack. They are still armed and going after the enemy. This man was wounded and unarmed. There's a huge difference between, despite the fact that both people are wounded, one is actively attacking and one is not. Shooting someone who's not attacking and unarmed is completely different from shooting someone that is armed and is attacking, even if they are both wounded. This is a completely ridiculous comparison, as they are two different sets of circumstances. Canadian soldiers in the Normandy campaign were ever wary of the enemy pretending to be dead and then fighting back. This is essentially the same argument over again, just with our side having done the same thing as the other side. He's just repeated the same argument twice, and it doesn't make it any more true, the different set of circumstances. My father, a machine gunner in 1917, played dead during a German attack on Canadian trenches, then came to life and gunned down the attackers, thus earning a military medal. That several times now Worthington has compared an unarmed, not attacking wounded soldier to someone who is either not wounded or pretending to be dead, who then was actively attacking people. This is not an adequate comparison. These are two different set of circumstances. One is attacking, one is not attacking. One is armed, one is not armed. By repeating this over and over again, he's painting in the mind of the reader, who's going to be, in the case of Sun Media, an obvious pro-war patriot who's not going to put much of an investigation into what Worthington is saying, and then thus starting to believe that the unarmed wounded man is somehow equivalent to an armed man who is attacking. This is a very dishonest straw man kind of attack. This is not real. This is not how things happened in the situation that went on trial. Vince was in C Company and recalls stepping around the bodies of blackwashed casualties when his lieutenant shouted that a Chinese was crouched near a bunker. Vince cautiously approached, ready to fire, and saw the guy's head was bloodied and that he had a grenade in his hand. I would have shot him in the head, but the lieutenant and a blackwashed lieutenant were in my line of fire, Vince recalls. The bullet would have gone through them, so I raised my Enfield and then banged him hard on the skull. I called out to them, "He's dead," then walked away. Again, dishonestly comparing a wounded, unarmed person who was not attacking to a wounded person who was armed and was trying to attack. It's a completely dishonest comparison that's meant to, as I said, build a straw man argument. A series of stories about what the conditions in war are like, and a book on the Afghan war telling about suicide bombers. So as a final argument as to why it was okay to shoot an unarmed wounded person who wasn't presenting a threat is that war is bad and it's taxing on the psyche of people in war. Now, I'm sure it is. War is a horribly inhumane thing that happens, and nothing short of a psychopath wouldn't be affected by it. So I'm sure the war must have been weighing on the man's mind in some way, because he is a human being. However, that doesn't exactly explain or even justify shooting an unarmed person. All this is trying to do is build up sympathy for him. He's one of our troops. He's out there sacrificing for us, so we can't be critical of him. It doesn't work that way. Shooting an unarmed person is a greasy, cowardly thing to do, especially one that's wounded and can't defend themselves. It is, and regardless of the psychological motivations for doing so, that may or may not even exist, I don't know, maybe Worthington's implying post-traumatic stress. I do not know. I'm not implying that. Either way, shooting an unarmed wounded person is not an okay thing to do. Now, this is a perfect example of not just Sun media, but right-wing ideology in particular coming up with very weak arguments to justify the positions that they hold. And not only that, to justify attacking people who can't defend themselves. I mean, this is not the same thing as cutting welfare programs or cutting healthcare and education to the people who need it most. But it is the same line of thinking that there really is no innocent people. There is no defenseless, and that anyone who is defenseless in some way must be responsible for that situation. Now, in truth, what probably happened was that Semru attacked the guy because of the conditions of war. He was mad at him. Maybe he was mad that the war was going on. Maybe he lost a friend and he was taking it out on him. Revenge, which is a lot more understandable than anything else. Now, the judge's statement is true. Every Canadian soldier is an ambassador of Canadian values. Now, if this is what Peter Worthington thinks is a Canadian value, shooting an unarmed wounded person, then this would not be the first time that my values and the values of my country diverged sharply.